Marjorie McPherson had never believed in magical objects, even though she ran an eclectic antique shop that was rumored to be filled with enchanted trinkets. She considered her shop more a place of passing curiosities than a portal to any real magic. People would wander in, pick up a chipped porcelain swan or a tarnished music box, feel some sense of nostalgia, and leave with a lighter wallet. That was her usual understanding of the world, until the day she discovered a peculiar hairbrush tucked behind a dusty trunk in the back room. It wasn't special at first glance. Its wooden handle was worn, with faded carvings that looked like they might have once been flowers. The bristles were stiff and uneven, something that could have easily ended up in the waste bin, but there was a faint shimmer to its surface that caught Marjorie's eye, a glint that made her think it had been polished with stardust, or maybe just an enthusiastic spritz of furniture polish. She wasn't entirely sure. Curious, she placed it on the checkout counter, figuring she might dust it off and add it to her window display to amuse the occasional hairbrush aficionado, if such a person existed. That evening, when she'd closed up the shop, Marjorie gave the brush a few playful swipes through her own hair. "Might as well see if you're worth anything," she joked half to herself. At first, nothing happened. No lightning bolt, no singing angels, no ominous drum roll. Then came a curious tingle at the nape of her neck, like a faint electric current. Before she could think better of it, words began tumbling from her mouth. "A splendid comb for tresses fair, a muse's gift beyond compare, O gentle brush, with bristles proud, thou stoke in me a spirit loud." Startled, Marjorie clapped her hand over her mouth. Where had that come from? She certainly hadn't intended to recite poetry to her own reflection in the cracked mirror behind the counter. She tried to speak again to see if perhaps she was just imagining things, but nothing happened, aside from a normal quiver in her voice. Shrugging, she replaced the brush on the counter. "Long day," she muttered, chalking it up to exhaustion. She locked up and headed upstairs, where she lived in a small flat above her shop. Little did she know that her life, and the lives of many others, was about to get a lot more lyrical. The next morning, Marjorie nearly forgot about this strange incident. She bustled around with her usual routine, watering the spider plants in the window and making sure the crocheted doilies lay neatly beneath the display figurines. Just before she opened the door to customers, she glimpsed the brush on the counter. The memory of her whimsical verse made her cheeks warm. "I'll just set you out here," she mumbled under her breath, "and see if anyone cares for a battered old brush." She placed the hairbrush by the cash register. It seemed to sparkle under the morning light. Soon, the bell above the shop's entrance chimed, and in walked Mrs. Hetty Parker, a longtime customer known for her keen eye for deals. She was a tall woman with perpetually pursed lips, always ready to haggle over the smallest discount. Hetty greeted Marjorie with a curt nod and meandered through the aisles, occasionally pausing to scrutinize some obscure piece of porcelain or tarnished silver spoon. Eventually, she found her way to the front and noticed the hairbrush. "My granddaughter needs a new brush," Hetty mused aloud, poking at it as though it might bite. "She's always complaining about her tangles. Is this new?" "Oh, I just found it," Marjorie replied, feeling a touch nervous. She had no idea if the brush would sprout poetry again or simply remain a normal object collecting dust. Hetty picked it up and started running it through her meticulously coiffed hair. There was a pregnant pause, during which she narrowed her eyes as if waiting for some bizarre tingle in her scalp. Then, voice trembling, she began, "Release these tangles in my mane, for in thy bristles lies arcane and splendid might with gentle gleam, to crown my head a polished queen." Marjorie's jaw dropped. Hetty looked equally startled. She jerked the brush away, nearly flinging it across the room. For a moment, both women stared at each other in silence. Then Hetty coughed, patted her hair as though it might have turned into golden ringlets, and said in her usual brisk tone, "I'll take it. $2 off because it's obviously used." Still in shock, Marjorie rang up the sale at a slight discount, and Hetty marched out, hairbrush in tow. Only when Hetty was safely gone did Marjorie allow herself to breathe. "I did not imagine that," she whispered, patting her own cheeks to confirm she was indeed awake. The brush was definitely some kind of magical item, granting verse and flourish to whoever used it. She had just as definitely sold it for next to nothing, meaning it would soon be out of her life. But that wasn't the end of it, far from it. Over the next few days, Marjorie began hearing rumors around the small town of Hoppleton. Spontaneous poems were cropping up in the oddest of circumstances. An unsuspecting neighbor claimed that Hetty's granddaughter Linda had taken the brush to school. While in the restroom, Linda used the brush to fix her ponytail, then burst out reciting a mournful ballad about the cafeteria's hamburger surprise. Linda's drama teacher, upon hearing her new poetic flair, had promptly offered her the lead role in the upcoming school play. Meanwhile, confusion and curiosity swirled among teachers and students alike. Word began to spread about the magical brush. Some thought it was a hoax or an elaborate publicity stunt. Others merely giggled at the idea that any inanimate object could cause recitations of random verse. In any case, that single battered hairbrush was quickly becoming the hottest topic in Hoppleton. While the local chatter soared, Hetty Parker, noticing how interested everyone was in this bizarre artifact, decided to display it prominently in her living room. Curious neighbors who stopped by on the pretense of borrowing sugar or returning a casserole dish would sneak glances at the brush, perched on a purple velvet cushion. For an additional flourish, Hetty demanded that any visitor who wanted to see or handle the brush must pay a small maintenance fee. That was how she referred to it anyway. In reality, it was just a ticket price disguised as a donation. In exchange, they got to run the brush through their hair a few times and experience the thrill of spontaneously uttering some dramatic stanzas. Unsurprisingly, people didn't remain quiet about their experiences. Soon, half the town had heard directly from the other half that the brush worked, and it worked every time. Marjorie, who had heard the fuss, was torn between utter fascination and mild annoyance. The brush belonged in her shop, or so she kept telling herself. She was the one who had unearthed it. She was the one who'd had that first bizarre experience. To see Hetty profiting from it by charging money for poetry sessions made her stomach knot. That again she had agreed to sell it. A deal was a deal, even if the buyer was now reaping a windfall in ephemeral verse. Yet the simplest joys of life in Hoppleton took a strange turn during those weeks. You might visit the local diner and see 3 or 4 people huddled over a cup of coffee, whispering about how they'd heard Farmer Lackley recite a pastoral ode when he tested the brush at Hetty's house. Corn husk whisper across fields wide, the crow, the sun, and time collide. O golden harvest, friend of toil, rise triumphant from the loyal soil. While some found the phenomenon enchanting, others were increasingly perturbed. The local library saw a surge in interest for classic poetry and Shakespeare, as if everyone wanted to brush up on their poetic knowledge. But the librarians were also dealing with more and more annoyed patrons who felt overshadowed by the hairbrush's easy magic. Okay, sure, it's fun, they'd say, but it's hardly fair that something can just hand you the gift of rhyme without any hard work. One of the librarians, a spirited man named Garrett with a perpetually crooked bow tie, became particularly obsessed. Garrett had spent years writing free verse and struggling to find an audience. He was a fixture at local open mic nights, yet people tended to yawn or wander away when he started reading his poems about existential dread and the meaning of life. The idea that some old brush could bestow the mesmerizing power of beautifully flowing verse to anyone rankled him deeply. Why had he bothered refining his craft for all these years? He decided to get to the bottom of this phenomenon. So it was that Garrett arrived at Hetty's house one afternoon, meager attendance fee in hand, and asked politely if he could see the brush for research purposes. Hetty led him into her living room with a gleam in her eye. She'd been charging people steadily for a week now, and Garrett was just the latest in a long line. He paid the small fee, sat down on Hetty's sofa, and prepared himself. Hetty placed the brush in his hands, a smug expression on her face. Garrett took a deep breath and ran the brush gently through his short, spiky hair. For a moment, nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. Hetty cleared her throat impatiently as though he were a defective poet. A faint flicker of disappointment crossed Garrett's eyes. Then, suddenly, by gentle bristle or cosmic grace, in measured lines this time and place, shall know the fierce desire I bear to shape my soul in words so fair. He finished, and the echo of his phrase lingered in the air like a lingering chord struck on a piano. Instead of looking impressed, Garrett appeared downright exasperated. "It's too easy," he exclaimed. "It's not earned. It's a cheat. This brush is making poetry meaningless." Despite his frustration, he couldn't deny that the sensation of speaking those words felt weirdly empowering, as though the brush awakened a part of him that he'd never quite reached without it. And it stung him to realize that. Garrett marched out, more determined than ever to figure out how the brush worked. He wasn't going to let some magical tchotchke overshadow the real dedication of writing. He began snooping around, pestering neighbors and friends to find out all they could about the brush's origin, hoping a lead might guide him to a more permanent solution. Maybe a secret incantation hidden in an old book or a special knowledge that would allow him to replicate or counteract it. Eventually, his search led him back to the unassuming Miss Marjorie McPherson. If Marjorie was surprised to see Garrett appear in her shop one afternoon looking intensely curious, she did her best not to show it. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, eyeing his crooked bow tie. She half expected him to launch into a spontaneous poem if she offered him a handshake. Garrett launched into a flurry of questions. "How did you find the brush? Do you know its origins? Did you feel any magical aura when you first touched it?" It was the kind of interrogation Marjorie rarely experienced outside of rummage sale disputes. She told him everything. How she'd discovered it behind an old trunk, how she'd tried it once and recited a silly rhyme, how she'd sold it to Hetty. She then slipped in her own regret about the sale, confiding to Garrett that she disliked how Hetty had turned the brush into a money-making spectacle. Garrett nodded solemnly. "I see," he said, tapping a pen against his notepad. "I can't stand it either. As a poet, I feel it cheapens the art, and yet," he paused, "it's undeniably powerful. There's something about the effortless creation of verse that intrigues me. But I don't want it out in the wild, turning random townsfolk into Shakespeare for the price of a convenience store soda. It's extreme, I know, but it's how I feel." Marjorie found herself empathizing. The hairbrush was fun, but it had begun to warp the town's artistic energy into a novelty act. She glanced at Garrett. "I wonder if we should try getting it back," she said quietly, the corners of her mouth quirking. "If we had it in my shop, we could at least keep it under some control. We could study it, or put it into safekeeping, or something else, anything else, so it's not parading around Hoppleton and Hetty Parker's living room." Garrett's eyes lit up. "Let's do it," he whispered, with all the fervor of a secret mission. He pressed his notes into his jacket pocket. "I'll come up with a plan." The next day, they put their plan into action. Garrett was to return to Hetty's house, feigning a kind of obsession with the brush's powers, offering to buy it for an exorbitant price. Meanwhile, Marjorie would show up too, leading Hetty to believe there was a bidding war. Perhaps the inflated offers would tempt Hetty enough that she'd let go of her precious treasure. It was risky. Hetty liked the small but steady stream of revenue people paid to use the brush, but maybe the promise of a larger lump sum would be enough to persuade her. Garrett arrived at the Parker house around midday. He was armed with an old dictionary stuffed with $1.00 bills, enough to look like a huge slush fund, though it only amounted to a couple $100 at best. Hetty greeted him with her usual suspicious expression, but perked up considerably when he displayed the dictionary full of cash. "How may I help you, dear?" Her tone was suddenly sweet. Garrett put on his best earnest face and explained that he simply must have the hairbrush for personal inspiration. He claimed to be writing an epic poem and needed it to channel his muses. Hetty's eyes flickered with interest. "Well," she said, "I've been charging folks $5 a brush, so I'm not sure I want to lose that income." Yet money was her first love, and Garrett could practically see her calculating how many brushed heads it would take to reach the lump sum he might offer. Just then, a polite rap sounded at the Parkers' front door. Marjorie stood outside, purse in hand. She stepped in with an air of forced haughtiness, as though she'd woken up that morning certain she was the richest woman in Hoppleton. Hetty's eyes darted from Garrett's dictionary to Marjorie's purse. You too? She asked slowly. Marjorie lifted her chin. I've been told you're selling the brush, she said in a grand tone, glancing at Garrett as if to feign surprise at his presence. I simply must have it back. Name your price. The plan was a clumsy con, and it all felt like an amateur pantomime. But fortune was on their side. Hetty's eyes swung greedily from one prospective buyer to the other. Let's not be hasty, she purred, seating them on her pristine sofa. She brought each of them a cup of lukewarm tea, though neither was eager to sip. Let's talk numbers, she said, leaning forward eagerly. Garrett went first, tapping the dictionary. 200, he announced, feigning confidence. Hetty pursed her lips, unimpressed. She looked at Marjorie, who grimaced, as though forced to recall some ancient buried treasure. After a beat, Marjorie said, I'll give you 3. Hetty's eyes widened. 300? She paused, then turned back to Garrett. Well, can you beat that? Garrett's heart hammered. He had nowhere near that amount in reality, but he decided to bluff. 350, he said, swallowing hard. Then Marjorie feigned offense and countered, 400, no matter that she had about $32.00 and a coupon for half-off orchard apples in her actual purse. This was high-stakes theater, purely for Hetty's benefit. Leaning back, Hetty pressed her palms together, gaze flicking in excitement. 400 and it's yours, she declared to Marjorie, sure that Garrett could go no higher. Garrett glared, keeping up appearances. Fine, he huffed. I'll go write my epic poem without that silly brush. He stood, feigning defeat, and stormed out of the house. Inside, he could practically skip from relief. He'd set the stage for Marjorie to take the brush back for a sum that didn't even exist. With Garrett gone, Hetty turned to Marjorie. All right, she said. Count out the money and it's yours. Marjorie, her heart racing, fiddled with her purse. She'd prepared herself to talk her way out of actually handing over wads of cash she didn't have. Hetty dear, she began sweetly, since you're such a longtime friend and neighbor, how about we come to an arrangement? I can pay you an installment, maybe 100 now and the rest over the next couple of months. She paused, trying to gauge Hetty's reaction. Hetty's triumphant grin began to fade. Installments? Absolutely not. I can't part with my biggest moneymaker for a mere promise. Sensing that she was losing her advantage, Marjorie scrambled. She rummaged in her purse, pulling out all the cash she had, $32.00, plus a handful of change. This is all I have on me, she mumbled, wincing. But I'll throw in a free antique silver frame worth $70 retail. Hetty's eyebrows shot up, uncertainty dancing across her features. It was in that moment that Linda, Hetty's granddaughter, bounded into the living room. Grandma, can I use the brush again for my audition tomorrow? She asked breathlessly. The teacher says. She broke off upon spotting Marjorie. Her gaze fell to the meager stack of cash on the table. Linda's face fell into disappointment. She looked at Hetty. You're not selling it, are you? It's mine now. Her eyes sparked with teenage indignation. Hetty looked from Linda, her beloved granddaughter, who'd been winning accolades with her newfound poetic skill, to Marjorie, who looked slightly desperate but determined. Stuck in a moral quandary between quick cash or letting Linda keep her magical powers, Hetty gave a small sigh. I'm sorry, she said, crossing her arms, but I can't sell it. It brings Linda so much confidence and happiness. And, she added, her voice lowering, the money it brings me isn't half bad either. Marjorie realized she was in trouble. With Linda's emotional plea, Hetty's resolve was strengthening. The plan was crumbling. Fearing she'd forever lose the brush to Hetty's homegrown fortune, Marjorie searched for words. She felt the tension swirling with no easy path forward. She decided to try honesty. Hetty, that brush might have seemed entertaining, but don't you think leading the whole town in random poetic outbursts is, well, out of control? Don't you worry about Linda building her confidence on an object she can't rely on forever? What if the brush's powers fade? How will she feel then? This might be giving her a false sense of security. Linda's face flushed. I don't care, she snapped. It helped me land a part in the play. I love it. Marjorie's breath caught. She wanted to protest further, but the raw emotion in Linda's voice stilled her. For a moment, she remembered being a shy teenager, longing for even a hint of magic to buoy her sense of self-worth. She sighed. "All right," she said softly. "I understand. The brush is yours." Linda's eyes were bright as she realized Marjorie wasn't going to fight. Hetty watched Marjorie carefully, trying to see if there was some ruse at play, but Marjorie simply stood, fixed her blouse, and said, "Please, just remember, real talent, real self-belief, those come from inside, not from a hairbrush." She nodded politely and headed for the door, feeling both disappointed and oddly relieved. Word traveled fast that day that Marjorie had attempted to buy back the brush and failed. Some folks teased her for it. Others admired her tenacity. Garrett showed up at her shop that evening with half a smile and half a shrug. "Our plan didn't work then," he said softly, resting an elbow on a glass counter filled with old rings. "They wouldn't sell?" She shook her head. "Linda loves it," she murmured, "and I guess I can't blame her." "Maybe we should just let them keep it." Garrett fiddled with one of the rings under the glass. "I'm not sure I can do that," he admitted, "but I'll give it a rest. If Linda truly wants it, and it's giving her something, maybe that's got its own kind of magic that doesn't need interfering." In the following weeks, Hoppleton slowly moved on from the brush craze. Yes, people still visited Hetty from time to time, and Linda certainly used it before every drama club practice. She built up a reputation as a star of local theater, and ironically, she began writing her own original pieces, short comedic sketches, that got raving laughs at open mic nights. Over time, she discovered that she'd been internalizing all that poetry in a way that made her own creativity blossom, even when she wasn't brushing her hair. Eventually, she wasn't relying on the brush at all. Her self-assurance had grown beyond it. Garrett noticed Linda's progress with a measure of awe. He even complimented her writing at a local coffee shop one evening. "You've got real talent," he said, smiling. Linda, blushing, mumbled her thanks. A moment later, she offered him the battered old brush. "It's done enough for me," Linda said. "Maybe you can study it for your poems now." Garrett was startled, but then let out a genuine laugh. "I appreciate that," he said, taking it from her gently. "Maybe it'll inspire me once or twice." Yet a few days later, the brush found its way back to Marjorie's antique shop. Garrett had left it on the counter while she was in the back rummaging for inventory. He scribbled a note that read, "This brush has run its course here, but wonder not, for do not fear. The muse once found inside its wood now blooms in hearts, just as it should." Marjorie interpreted that as a quiet declaration that perhaps Hoppleton had outgrown the need for magic verse on demand. She chuckled and placed the brush in her display case. Occasionally, someone passing through town, hearing faint rumors of a magical hairbrush, would wander in and ask to see it. Marjorie would let them hold it, smile warmly, and observe as they tried to spark poetry from its bristles. Sometimes it still worked. Words would bubble forth in a flourish of rhymes. Other times, it remained silent, as if it sensed the user's intentions. Marjorie suspected the brush's power had begun to fade, or perhaps it only showed itself to those who carried an earnest longing for expression. Whenever it did spring to life, Marjorie would quietly marvel at the wonder in the person's eyes. She never again tried to sell the brush. It was now a small but special part of her shop, a humble ambassador for a truth she'd come to embrace. Real creativity, real artistry, isn't about borrowed magic or easy shortcuts, though they might nudge someone in the right direction once in a while. Instead, it's about what's inside us, waiting to be seen. If you asked Marjorie whether she believed in enchanted antiques now, she might give you a wry smile and point to that battered old hairbrush in her case. "Magic is real," she'd say, "but it only lasts as long as you let it breathe in you." And with that, she'd brush aside the dust on her display, offering you the chance to find your own poetry, if you dared. And if you did, you just might catch yourself bursting into verse, leaving with far more than you ever expected to find in a quiet antique shop on an ordinary day.